The Florida Senate's Education Committee is under fire after approving legislation that would bar Florida school teachers and officials from encouraging conversations about sexual orientation and gender identity in primary grade levels or at any level if it's in a manner deemed not age appropriate for students. Named the Don't Say Gay law by its critics, the legislation also limits these conversations from taking place during student counseling and expands parents' rights to sue school districts for concealing students' sensitive mental and physical health information.
Florida Governor Ron DeSantis announced his support for the legislation earlier this week, saying, quote, "We've seen instances of students being told by different folks in school, oh, don't worry, don't pick your gender yet, do all this other stuff. They won't tell the parents about these discussions that are happening," DeSantis said. "That is entirely inappropriate." Meanwhile, President Joe Biden slammed the bill yesterday in a tweet, calling it hateful and telling LGBTQ students, quote, "I have your back and my administration will continue to fight for the protections and safety you deserve." Our rising panel joins us now to weigh in. Andrew Feldman is a Democratic strategist. Emily Jashinsky is culture editor at The Federalist. Welcome to you both.
Hey there.
Good to be here.
So, Emily, we'll start with you. I don't know that Don't Say Gay was like the totally accurate kind of framing of what this is. On the other hand, it does look like both micromanaging and also non-specific, like who gets to decide what age-appropriate discussions are. Also, I think it's very naive that, kids they have the internet at their disposal. They're they're learning about all these kinds of concepts from social media, from other things. I don't know. What do you think about this?
Yeah, so I think DeSantis is right that there are instances of just inappropriate conversations that we have seen, really around the country. Then on the other hand, I do think some of these bills, whether they're about CRT or gender identity, have gone too far. I did just read the bill, and in this case, I think there is some overbroad language, but I also think that when you're talking about the primary grades, which this bill says, as Ryan pointed out, there are exceptions for things that are deemed, quote, age inappropriate at higher levels. But when we're talking about kids who are literally children, 5 to 10 years old, no, teachers should absolutely not be having these discussions about gender identity, but they are. That's actually in curriculum. In some states, they're actually using curriculum to talk about gender identity, starting in kindergarten and going all the way up. So I don't know that this law is the answer to the problem, but I do believe that it is addressing a problem.
Yeah.
And Andrew, how would you design something like this if parents are saying that they don't want gender identity discussed in kindergarten or whatever, or do you think that that's just not? You think the school should be able to, design its curriculum however it wants? How would you design this?
Well, what I would say is that the mission of the Ron DeSantis administration since he took office has been to hurt people. And this is another piece of legislation that's going to just do just that. I agree with President Biden that it's hateful. It is going to have tremendous consequences on the mental health of kids struggling with these questions, and it's going to push them further and further away from being their true selves. And I think there needs to be able to be a safe place in schools. To say that you can't have counselors have these conversations is just sick, and it's just so disheartening that at this 2022, this is where we are in America, and it's all because from some delusional notion by Governor DeSantis and the extreme state legislature in Florida that, by not talking about this, it's going to prevent people from being members of the LGBTQ community, and it's just nonsense.
Andrew, should we teach 5-year-olds that gender is non-binary?
I think we should teach 5-year-olds the truth about gender, which is that there are a lot of different people choose different genders. Absolutely. We absolutely should teach them the definition of non-binary. We should teach them the definition of male and female and transgender. Absolutely. Let's not hide the truth from 5-year-olds. let's be honest about the conversation we're having in society. And because guess what? As was mentioned earlier, folks are looking at this on the internet, and if 5-year-olds have phones, I mean, but the truth is, the earlier you can come out, the better you are for your life. And people have identified that 5-year-olds can know that they aren't male or female, and they do identify as non-binary. I think it sets a very, very dangerous precedent. Just as it does if someone is not diagnosed with a learning disability early in life. And let me be clear, this is not a diagnosis, but we should absolutely have these conversations so kids understand what's going on in society, and they know what these definitions of these issues are. Let's not hide the truth, which is about gender fluidity and the truth about gender in this country and in the world.
I get the issue with that. Look, I'm hearing you. There's not going to be widespread agreement on what the definitions of some of these things are, even between like the four of us here. So the idea that you could have like a school curriculum that it's not simple enough. It will obviously there'll be parents who disagree with it, and I would be concerned probably at the level of children that young. By 6th, 7th, and 8th grade, they have hormones. They're interested in dating. Yes, I think it would be horrible to have a law that prevents a budding teenager from talking to a counselor about sexuality and gender, etc.
But that's what this law does, Robbie.
Right. So I agree. Yeah, I agree. I don't support the law either. But there's some.
That's what the concern is. This isn't and let me just point out, this isn't a narrow law. Republicans and DeSantis are doing this on purpose. They're making this broad. And let me pivot to another piece of legislation, HB 7, the Stop Woke bill, that is moving just as quickly in the legislature. And the aim is to prevent conversations about race and to whitewash history that would let in not only schools, but in the workplace that would allow parents and customers to sue. I mean, this is just out of control. And, I would not be comfortable living with children in Florida right now.
Husband to Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg, Chasten Buttigieg, made his case against the bill's passing last month, tweeting, quote, "This will kill kids. Ron DeSantis, you are purposefully making your state a harder place for LGBTQ kids to survive in. A national survey, 42% of LGBTQ youth seriously considered attempting suicide last year. Now they can't talk to their teachers." So, Emily, I wonder I think there is kind of a difference here actually between like the sexuality question and the gender question. Sexuality stuff, to the extent this looks more hardwired or ingrained than the gender stuff where we're trying to find out, or we're experts on this are weighing whether there is some kind of social contagion effect, or like hearing about it makes you more likely to, for some period of time, identify as gender fluid or non-binary, and then later, not have that be part of your identity. So I think that's where maybe the concern is coming from parents, that on that particular category, having conversations or learning about it, particularly from an activist standpoint, is going to drive a phenomenon that is to some extent artificial. What do you think?
Absolutely. There are numbers, pretty good numbers, that show about 70% of people that show gender dysphoria in childhood, which is, of course, very real and very painful, will eventually identify with their sex. And so with numbers like that, I think, it's very interesting to see concerns that are very real coming from parents who you can talk to them, as I have, and I'm sure you have as well, Robbie, whether it's CRT or gender identity or sexuality, you could be talking to minorities or people who are fully pro-LGBT, but are very uncomfortable with this happening around their children. And I think to dismiss those concerns as the conspiratorial right-wing agenda to whitewash history and, change the schools and to fit all of their narratives, I think is really dangerous. I think the hyperbole to refer to this legislation, whether or not you like Ron DeSantis, but to refer to the legislation as hateful and to say that it will literally kill people, it speaks to a problem that we talked about on this panel, where, Robbie, you mentioned we can't even share definitions of some basic terms like male and female and sex and gender. It's a bigger problem in the country. And how can we have laws that rely on us being able to have those shared definitions of what constitutes a man or a woman or sexuality when people can't even agree on what those definitions are? So the problem here is a lot deeper, but I think it is very unwise and very unhelpful for children to minimize the concerns people have about teaching this stuff in grades when kids are 5 to 10 years old in ways that can be very, very confusing and mentally detrimental. I'm not saying that this piece of legislation is perfectly targeted, but I don't think denigrating the attempts to sort of address this legislatively as hateful or anything else is particularly helpful.
And Andrew, as a Democratic strategist, I want to get your take on the kind of raw politics of this. You obviously remember back in 2004 when Karl Rove made his famous push to put a whole bunch of anti-marriage equality ballot measures in Ohio and other swing states to try to draw out an evangelical vote to benefit Bush in the re-election. He really picked a culture war fight, and by doing that, it forced Democrats to ask the question of which side of that they were on, because for years people like Barack Obama and others said they just wanted to avoid it. They were for civil unions, but they didn't want to touch it. But when they were forced to actually choose a side, they chose the side of civil rights in that, and I think elevating that in 2004 actually accelerated the fight and accelerated the acceptance of marriage equality later. So in a weird way, it kind of backfired on Rove. But with this one, it feels different. It feels like they're doing kind of the same strategy. It's Republicans who are introducing these bills around the country because they feel like there's gold in those culture war hills for them. But as Democrats are looking at it, it feels like Democratic voters are much less sure about what side they're going to come down on. Like in 2004, it eventually became clear they were going to be on the side of marriage equality and civil rights. On this one, 5 and 6 year olds and gender identity, it's a lot dicier, it seems like, for a lot of Democratic voters. But I'm curious what you're seeing kind of in the polling and focus groups and among Democratic strategists that you talk to.
Look, I think there's a lot of concern that this is something Republicans are doing, not because of enthusiasm in the Republican base, but because of what it's going to do, the stigma it's going to send to children across the country. When this is something that majority of people support talking about, we are on the right side of history. What I do think it will do politically is it's not going to increase the GOP base in Florida any more than they're already excited and engaged with these culture war debates. We know that the base in Florida turns out for the Republicans through the roof. We saw that after, major natural disasters in 2018 for DeSantis. That's not something that I think is going to change. But I do think legislation like this, the abortion debate that's going to continue around the midterms, is going to enthuse Democratic voters and turn them out, because this is what is at stake. Are we going to continue to silence and limit conversations and put groups of people in society at risk? Or are we going to be a society that supports them and supports equality? And that's where I think we are in this country right now.
Last word, Emily, and then we got to wrap.
Yeah, I would just add, I think we need to be very careful not to put people at risk with the excesses of this ideology in classrooms, because I think we have already seen that happen to a lot of young women. And there is a lot of concern on the left about that, not as much as I think is appropriate, but there is some. And the only other thing I'd say is, Republican base may be animated by these issues, but I think the case study of Virginia and Glenn Youngkin showed that independents, in some cases, will be animated by these issues as well.
Andrew, Emily, thank you for joining us. Great discussion over a very difficult subject, so thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks.
And we'll be back with more Rising in just a minute.